Welcome to London Gritty Chronicles. I am your narrator. The year is 1347. The month is October. Imagine you are standing on the stone docks of Messina, a busy port city on the island of Sicily. The air is usually filled with the smell of salt, fish, and expensive spices arriving from the east. But today, the wind carries a different scent. It is sweet, heavy, and rotting. 12 galleys, large trading ships, drift into the harbor. They fly the flag of Genoa. Usually, the arrival of Genoese ships means wealth, trade, and news from distant lands. The dockworkers run to the water's edge to catch the ropes. Merchants prepare their ledgers to count silk and grain. But when the ships glide closer, the cheering stops. The decks are silent. There is no captain shouting orders. There are no sailors climbing the rigging. When the Sicilian locals board the ships, they find a nightmare. Most of the sailors are dead. The few who are still alive are barely human. They are covered in black swellings, mysterious oozing lumps the size of eggs or apples in their armpits and groins. They are coughing blood. They are delirious with fever. The people of Messina do not know it yet, but they have just opened the door to the end of the world. This is the beginning of the Great Pestilence, later known as the Black Death. Within a few short years, it will kill perhaps half the population of Europe. But this documentary series is not just about the biology of a bacteria. We are here to understand the mind of the medieval person. How did they explain a catastrophe that science could not yet see? When the doctors failed and the medicine did not work, where did they turn? They turned to the sky. They turned to the church. They turned to God. For the next hour, we will journey into the religious meaning of the plague. We will explore how medieval Europeans framed illness as sin, punishment, or a divine warning. We will analyze the sermons that shaped their behavior, and along the way, we will master the English vocabulary of morality, judgment, and abstract reasoning. Let's return to that dock in Messina. As the Genoese sailors were dragged off the ships, the sickness jumped. It moved from the sailors to the dockworkers, then to their families. Within days, the dying began. Now, pause and think about the word cause. In modern English, when we ask for the cause of a disease, we expect a scientific answer. We expect words like bacteria, virus, infection, or flea. We look for a physical agent. But in 1347, the word cause had a different weight. The medieval mind worked on a hierarchy, a ladder of reality. At the bottom was the physical world. Yes, they knew that bad air, or miasma, could make you sick. They knew that being near a sick person was dangerous. But why did the air turn bad? Why did the sickness strike this person and not that person? To answer these deep questions, they looked to the first cause. They looked to the ultimate authority. Listen to this sentence. The pestilence is not merely a sickness of the body, but a manifestation of divine will. So, when the chronicler Michele da Piazza wrote about the arrival in Messina, he didn't just describe the symptoms, he described the meaning. He wrote that the Genoese ships carried sickness in their very bones, but he quickly shifted to the reason. The widely accepted view was that humanity had sinned. The world was full of greed, corruption, vanity, and war. God, like a strict father or a powerful king, had finally lost patience. This brings us to a crucial rhetorical pattern used in history: the argument from consequence. The logic goes like this. 1. We are suffering a terrible punishment, the plague. 2. A just God only punishes those who are guilty. 3. Therefore, we must be guilty of a terrible sin. The logic is perfect, provided you accept the premises. It creates a terrifying psychological loop. If you get sick, it is not just bad luck. It is a judgment. Let's look at the specific imagery they used. In medieval art and sermons, the plague was often represented as an arrow. Why an arrow? An arrow is sudden. It is silent until it hits. It travels through the air, invisible to the eye, until it strikes the flesh. And most importantly, an arrow is shot by an archer. It is not an accident. It is a weapon aimed with intent. There is a famous story from the Bible that every medieval person knew. It is the story of King David. When David sinned against God, God offered him a choice of punishments. David chose pestilence, and God sent an angel to strike down 70,000 men. In 1347, as the bodies piled up in the streets of Messina, priests climbed into their pulpits, the raised platforms in churches, and reminded the people of this story. "The arrows of God are flying," they warned. "Who is the target?" This metaphorical language changed how people behaved. If the plague is a biological accident, you try to run away or find a medicine. But if the plague is a divine arrow, you cannot run. God's aim is perfect. So, what do? You try to change the mind of the archer. This introduces a key English concept: atonement. Atonement, noun. Action taken to make up for a wrong or injury, seeking forgiveness through action. In Messina, panic set in. The people expelled the Genoese ships, driving them back out to sea. But it was too late. The invisible arrows were already flying through the city. The citizens realized that expelling the ships was a physical action, but they needed a spiritual action. They needed a miracle. According to historical accounts, the people of Messina marched to the shrine of the Virgin Mary. They gathered the bones of saints. They processed through the streets, barefoot, whipping themselves, crying out to heaven. This is a procession, a formal religious march. Imagine the sound, the chanting of monks, the weeping of mothers, the ringing of church bells, not the happy bells of a wedding, but the slow, heavy toll of the death knell. But here is the accidental twist of our story. The tragedy of the religious response is that it often fed the biological fire. By gathering together in massive crowds to pray for mercy, by packing into humid churches to beg for deliverance, rescue from danger, the people of Messina were doing exactly what the bacterium Yersinia pestis wanted. They were sharing breath. They were rubbing shoulders. They were coughing on each other in the hysteria of prayer. The church, meant to be a sanctuary, became a slaughterhouse. The Patriarch of Jerusalem, a high-ranking religious leader, wrote a letter that circulated through Europe. He did not talk about hygiene. He talked about the apocalypse. Apocalypse, noun. The complete final destruction of the world, as described in the biblical book of Revelation. He suggested that the plague was a sign that the end of time had arrived. The 4 horsemen were riding. As the winter of 1347 turned into 1348, the arrow flew from Sicily to the mainland of Italy. It struck Pisa. It struck Genoa. it struck the great city of Florence. The Italian writer Boccaccio, who witnessed the horror in Florence, wrote a famous introduction to his book, The Decameron. He described how the authority of the laws, both human and divine, had dissolved. Listen to this useful rhetorical contrast. Some thought that moderate living and the avoidance of all superfluity would preserve them from this accident. Here, superfluity means excess, too much food, too much drink. Others, Boccaccio continues, were of the contrary opinion. They affirmed that heavy drinking and the enjoyment of every appetite was the best medicine. You see, when the divine explanation fails to save you, society splits. Some become hyper-religious, ascetics. Others become nihilists, believing life has no meaning. But the dominant voice, the voice that roared from every cathedral in Europe, remained the voice of retribution. Retribution, noun. Punishment inflicted on someone as vengeance for a wrong or criminal act. The priests argued that the suffering of the body was necessary to cleanse the soul. They used a powerful metaphor, the scourge. A scourge is a whip used for punishment. But in abstract terms, a scourge of God is a person or event sent by God to punish humanity. By early 1348, the message was clear across Italy and France. We are under the scourge. The arrows are falling. The end is near. The people of Europe looked at their skin and saw the black boils. They looked at the sky and saw comets or storms. They connected the two using the logic of faith. The physical rot of the body was just a mirror of the moral rot of the soul. But if this was a punishment from God, a terrifying question emerged. A question that would shake the foundations of the church. Why were the priests dying too? If the plague was for sinners, why were the holy monks, the nuns, and the bishops falling dead at the altar? Why did God not protect his own house? This question would drive the next phase of the crisis. It would force people to look for new targets to blame. If the prayers weren't working, maybe it was because there was a traitor in their midst. Someone sabotaging the spiritual health of the community. As the plague moved north, aiming for England and Germany, the search for a scapegoat began. The arrow of wrath was about to turn into a weapon of human violence. As the spring of 1348 warmed the earth, the frozen bodies of winter began to thaw, and the pestilence accelerated. With a dangerous question hanging in the air. Why were the priests dying? In the medieval worldview, the priest was the essential bridge between the sinner and God. If the bridge collapses, how do you cross the river? The death rate among the clergy was shocking. In Montpellier, France, out of 140 Dominican friars, only 7 survived. In Avignon, the seat of the Pope, the churchyards were so full that the Pope consecrated the Rhone River, so bodies could be thrown directly into the water. This created a vacuum of authority. Vacuum, noun. A space entirely void of matter. In society, a situation where there is no leadership or control. When the official leaders, the bishops and priests, died or hid in fear, the people did not stop believing in God. Instead, they took religion into their own hands. They decided that the official prayers were too weak. They needed something stronger, something louder, something bloodier. Enter The flagellants. Imagine you are standing in a town square in Germany or the Low Countries, modern-day Netherlands. You hear a low, rhythmic drumming. Then a mournful chant begins. It is the Dies Irae, the Day of Wrath. A procession of men enters the city. They are walking 2 by 2. They wear white hoods drawn low over their faces, with red crosses painted on their chests and backs. They do not speak to the crowd. They march with military discipline. They are the Brotherhood of the Cross. When they reach the church square, they strip to the waist. They form a circle. And then, at a signal from their master, they take out their weapon. It is not a sword. It is a scourge, a heavy leather whip with 3 tails. At the end of each tail is a knot of iron spikes. They begin to beat themselves. Thwack, thwack, thwack. They strike their own backs until the skin breaks, until the blood flows down their trousers and splashes onto the dusty ground. They do not cry out in pain. They cry out in prayer. "Mercy! Mercy!" they scream. This phenomenon is known as mortification of the flesh. Let's look at this complex phrase. Mortification, noun. From the Latin mors, death. It means the action of subduing one's bodily desires through self-denial or physical pain. In modern English, if you are mortified, it means you are extremely embarrassed. You want to die of shame. But in 1348, mortification was a spiritual technology. It was a way to kill the sinful part of yourself so the spiritual part could live. The logic of the flagellants was simple but extreme. The plague is God's punishment for human luxury and comfort. Therefore, voluntary pain acts as a counterpayment. If we bleed now, willingly, God will not make us bleed later from the plague. They were trying to pay a debt to heaven, using their own blood as currency. This movement became a massive spectacle. Crowds gathered to watch. They dipped cloths in the flowing blood of the flagellants, treating it like the blood of saints. They believed these men were holy martyrs who could save the town. When the flagellants arrived in a city, the mood shifted from despair to fervor. People felt that finally someone was doing something active. The priests were just mumbling Latin in quiet churches. The flagellants were bleeding in the streets. For a brief moment, biology and society mirrored each other perfectly. The plague was a contagion that moved from town to town. The flagellant movement was a social contagion that followed the exact same roads. They marched for 33.5 days, 1 day for each year of Jesus Christ's life. They followed strict rules. They could not bathe. They could not sleep in soft beds. They could not speak to women. At first, even the Pope, Clement VI, watched them with interest. Perhaps this intense display of penitence would work. But soon, the mood turned darker. The flagellants began to claim that their rituals were more powerful than the church sacraments. They said their blood could wash away sins better than a priest's water. They began to interrupt church services. They took over the pulpits. They were crossing the line from devout Catholics to usurpers. Pope Clement VI, sitting in his palace in Avignon, realized he had a problem. He was surviving the plague by sitting between 2 massive roaring fires, breathing purified air, a surprisingly effective method that kept fleas away. From his smoke-filled room, he saw the flagellants not as saviors, but as a threat to his authority. If people could save themselves by whipping their own backs, why did they need the Pope? Why did they need to pay tithes to the Church? The accidental twist here is that the flagellants, who claimed to be saving the world, likely helped spread the plague. They moved from infected towns to healthy towns, carrying the fleas in their clothes and the bacteria in their open wounds. But they carried something else, too, something more dangerous than bacteria. They carried fanaticism. As the death toll continued to rise, despite all the whipping and bleeding, the flagellants grew frustrated. Their sacrifice wasn't working. God was still angry. Why? The rhetorical pattern shifted again. We are punishing ourselves, they argued, but there are others who are not being punished. There are enemies of Christ living among us. They are the reason God is still striking us. The emotional wave of the population shifted from awe, watching the flagellants, to rage, looking for a target. The flagellants began to preach a new message. It was no longer just about mortifying their own flesh. It was about destroying the flesh of the outsider. They turned their eyes toward the Jewish communities of Europe. The logic of the mob is terrifyingly simple. If the plague is a poison, someone must be poisoning the wells. We will descend into the darkest chapter of the Black Death's history. We will see how the language of spiritual cleansing transformed into the language of genocide. We will examine the terrible power of the scapegoat. With the rise of the flagellants and their shift from self-punishment to anger, this is where the story of the Black Death turns from a tragedy of nature into a tragedy of human nature. Let's define a critical English concept: scapegoat. The word comes from an ancient Jewish ritual where the sins of the people were symbolically placed onto a goat, which was then sent away into the desert. But in 1348, the metaphor became literal and deadly. As the pestilence raged across Europe, people looked for a physical cause to explain the invisible death. They could not see bacteria, they could not see fleas, but they could see their neighbors. A terrifying rumor began to spread. The Jews are poisoning the wells. This accusation did not come from nowhere. It was built on centuries of religious prejudice. But in the hysteria of the plague, it exploded. In Chillon, modern-day Switzerland, in the autumn of 1348, authorities tortured a Jewish surgeon named Balavinius. Under extreme pain, he confessed to a vast conspiracy. He said there was a powder made of spiders, frogs, lizards, and human hearts, distributed by rabbis to poison the water supply of Christians. This confession was a lie, extracted by torture. But in the medieval mind, a confession was proof. Once the proof existed, the violence began. It started in the Holy Roman Empire, modern-day Germany. In city after city, Freiburg, Strasbourg, Mainz, Cologne, mobs attacked the Jewish quarters. This was not just a riot. It was a systematic purge. In Strasbourg, the city council tried to protect the Jews. They argued that the plague was killing Jews too, so how could they be poisoning themselves? The logic was sound. But the mob did not want logic. They wanted a solution. They wanted the dying to stop. The guilds, the powerful associations of craftsmen and merchants, overthrew the city council. They installed a new government that was willing to act. On Valentine's Day, February 14th, 1349. A dark event took place in Strasbourg. The mob rounded up the entire Jewish community, men, women, and children. They took them to the Jewish cemetery. There they built a massive wooden platform, a house of wood. They forced the people inside. Then they set it on fire. This is a historical fact that is hard to read but essential to understand. It shows us how fear can bypass reason. Let's look at the emotional wave here. The mob felt righteous indignation. They believed they were doing God's work. By burning the poisoners, they were saving the city. But here is the bitter irony. The plague did not stop. In fact, it often got worse. The smoke from the burning bodies mixed with the smoke of the funeral pyres. The rats, fleeing the fires, carried the infected fleas into new neighborhoods. The violence against the Jews was condemned by the Pope himself. Pope Clement VI issued 2 papal bulls declaring the Jews innocent. He pointed out the obvious fact that Jews were dying of the plague just like Christians. He ordered the clergy to protect them. But the Pope was far away in Avignon. The mob was right there in the street. This reveals a breakdown of the hierarchy. The local priests and the flagellants ignored the Pope. They said the Pope was too soft. They said he had been bought by Jewish gold. This is an early example of a conspiracy theory. When reality is too painful to accept, random death from nature, people invent a story where someone is in control, a secret plot. It is psychologically comforting to have an enemy you can fight, rather than an enemy you cannot see. By 1351, the major Jewish communities of the Rhineland had been destroyed. Those who survived fled east to Poland and Lithuania, changing the demographics of Europe for centuries. But let's pause and look at the biology to society mirror again. While the mobs were burning people, the bacteria Yersinia pestis was mutating. It was adapting. And so was society. In England, the plague arrived in the summer of 1348. It entered through the port of Melcombe Regis in Dorset. The English response was less violent against minorities, partly because England had already expelled its Jews in 1290, but the religious framing was just as intense. King Edward III wrote a letter to the bishops. He spoke of the terrible pestilence and asked for intercession. He wanted the bishops to intercede with God, to ask for mercy. But as the plague swept through London, killing perhaps 40% of the city, a strange new sound began to replace the chanting of monks. Silence. The chroniclers write that there were not enough living to bury the dead. The bells stopped ringing because there was no one left to pull the ropes. And in this silence, a new kind of thinking began to emerge. A thinking that was less about, why is God doing this? And more about, how do we survive? The sheer scale of the death toll forced a pragmatism. If the processions didn't work, and the burning didn't work, and the flagellation didn't work, what was left? People began to notice patterns. They noticed that those who isolated themselves survived. They noticed that walled-up houses sometimes stayed safe. The accidental twist of the mid-14th century is that the failure of religion to stop the plague actually planted the seeds of science. It didn't happen overnight, but the cracking of the absolute authority of the Church began here. If the priest could not save you, and the Pope could not save you, you had to save yourself. This shift would eventually lead to the Renaissance. But first, the survivors had to deal with a new problem. The plague had killed the workers. The fields were full of rotting crops. The sheep were wandering untended, and the few peasants who were still alive looked at their lords and realized something powerful. There are fewer of us. That means we are worth more. The social order was about to be turned upside down. The arrow of wrath had killed the people, but it had also killed the old rules of economics. We will watch the survivors crawl out of the ruins. We will see how the English language itself began to change as the common people gained new power. We will explore the rise of dissent. With a silent revolution brewing in the fields, the workers were dead, and the survivors were waking up to their own value. But the church was not silent. In fact, the church was facing its own terrifying crisis. Imagine it is Sunday morning, 1349. You are a peasant in an English village. For your entire life, the church has been the center of your world. It is the stone anchor of your reality. You walk into the nave, the main body of the church. The air is cold. The familiar face of your old priest, Father Thomas, is gone. He died comforting the sick. He died doing his duty. In the pulpit stands a new man. He is young, perhaps a widower who lost his wife to the plague just weeks ago. He looks nervous. When he reads the Latin Mass, he stumbles over the words. He mispronounces the prayers. He is a hasty priest. This brings us to a critical term: ordination. Ordination, noun. The action of conferring holy orders on someone, making someone a priest. Usually, becoming a priest took years of study. You had to learn Latin, theology, and the complex rituals of the Mass. But the plague killed so many clergy. Historians estimate nearly 50% of English parish priests died, that the bishops panicked. They needed bodies to fill the pulpits, so they lowered the standards. In the Diocese of Norwich, the bishop ordained over 800 new priests in a single year. Many were barely literate. Some were described as shavelings, illiterate men who were just shaved and dressed in robes to fill the gap. Why does this matter? Because the authority of the church relied on mystique. Mystique, noun. A fascinating aura of mystery, awe, and power surrounding someone or something. If the priest cannot read the Bible, if he is just a frightened man like you, the mystique cracks. The biology to society mirror is clear here. The biological death of the experts led to the social death of expertise. The Bishop of Bath and Wells, seeing the shortage, issued a radical decree. He told his people that if they were dying and no priest was available, they could confess their sins to a layman. He even said, shockingly for the time, that they could confess to a woman. This was an emergency measure, but it planted a dangerous seed in the mind of the medieval peasant. If I can talk to God through my neighbor or my wife, why do I need the church? This question terrified the authorities. As the immediate horror of the Black Death faded, a new conflict emerged. The peasants, realizing their labor was scarce, began to demand higher wages. They refused to work for the old feudal rates. The landowners and the church fought back with a new kind of sermon. They weaponized the concept of avarice. Avarice, noun. Extreme greed for wealth or material gain. In the sermons of the 1350s, you start to hear a change in tone. Before the plague, the preachers scolded the rich for being greedy. Now they scolded the poor. They argued that a peasant asking for higher wages was disrupting the great chain of being. This was the belief that God had ordered society into a strict hierarchy. 1. God. 2. Angels. 3. Kings. 4. Nobles. 5. Peasants. 6. Animals. If a peasant tried to become rich, he was trying to jump a link in the chain. He was rebelling against God's design. Listen to the English poet John Gower, writing a few years after the plague. He reflects the fear of the elite. The world goeth fast from bad to worse, when shepherd and cowherd, for their part, demand more for their labor than the master bailiff was wont to take. He calls the rising peasants a weed that needs to be cut down. The King of England, Edward III, passed the Statute of Laborers in 1351. This law made it illegal to pay, or to accept, wages higher than pre-plague levels. But here is the accidental twist. You cannot legislate against supply and demand. The law failed. The peasants knew their worth. But the moral battle continued in the church every Sunday. The priests preached subservience. Subservience, noun. Willingness to obey others unquestioningly. They told the congregation, "Your suffering is a test. Your poverty is a virtue. Do not ask for more gold. Ask for more grace." But the audience was changing. They were survivors. They had looked death in the face. They had seen the bishops flee to their country estates, while the poor died in the cities. They had seen the holy priests die just as fast as the sinners. A deep cynicism began to take root. Cynicism, noun. An inclination to believe that people are motivated purely by self-interest. Skepticism about authority. The people still believed in God, devoutly, but they started to doubt the managers of God. This tension created a split in religious life. On one side, you had the official church trying to restore order and control. They built grand new chapels. They commissioned art showing the Dance of Death, Danse Macabre, reminding everyone that kings and peasants all end up as skeletons. The message was, don't get arrogant. Death is waiting. On the other side, you had a growing movement of private religion. People started buying small prayer books. They started building chantries, small private chapels where priests were paid to sing for their specific souls, not the whole community. It was the privatization of salvation. And in the shadows, new voices were whispering. Voices that would eventually become the Lollards. Lollard, noun. A follower of John Wycliffe, coming later in the century, who believed the Bible should be in English and the church should be poor. The Black Death prepared the ground for this. It stripped away the illusion of the church's invincibility. Let's look at the emotional wave of this period, 1350 to 1360. It moved from terror, the plague itself, to confusion. Why did the good die? To a strange empowerment. The survivors felt chosen. If God saved me, I must have a purpose. I am not just a cog in a machine. I am a survivor of the apocalypse. This psychological shift is crucial. You cannot understand the English Reformation, which happens 200 years later, without understanding this moment. The seeds of the break with Rome were watered by the plague. But before we get to the future, we must look at how the survivors dealt with the immediate past. They had a problem. Millions of people had died without the last rites. They had died in fields, in ditches, or in mass graves, without a priest to absolve their sins. According to strict medieval theology, these souls were in danger. They might be trapped in purgatory. Purgatory, noun. A place or state of suffering inhabited by the souls of sinners who are expiating their sins before going to heaven. The survivors felt a heavy burden of guilt.
I am alive, but my mother is dead, and she wasn't buried in holy ground.
So, a massive industry of remembrance began. We will explore the architecture of death. We will see how the guilt of the survivors transformed the physical landscape of England and Europe. We will learn how the fear of purgatory built the universities and colleges we know today, with the survivors standing on the edge of a theological abyss. Millions of their loved ones had died without the proper rituals. They were haunted by the idea of purgatory, that waiting room of the soul where fire burns away sin. This brings us to a powerful concept: legacy. Legacy, noun. Something left or handed down by a predecessor. But in the 1350s and 60s, legacy wasn't just about leaving money to your children. It was about leaving money to God, to bribe Him for mercy. The architecture of death transformed the skylines of Europe. If you visit Oxford or Cambridge University today, you are walking through the aftermath of the plague. Several colleges were founded directly because of the Black Death. Look at New College, Oxford, founded in 1379. Its founder, William of Wykeham, was explicit. He built the college to educate priests to replace those swept away by the pestilence. He asked the students to pray for his soul every day. Or look at Corpus Christi College, Cambridge, founded 1352. It was created by two guilds, United Survivors, specifically to pray for their deceased members. This was the biology to society mirror in stone. The biological loss of life created a stone replacement. The empty chairs at the dinner table were replaced by choir stalls in the chapel. But the most fascinating change was in the art of the tomb. Before the plague, tombs often showed the deceased looking peaceful, sleeping, or dressed in their finest armor and robes. These are called effigies. Effigy, noun. A sculpture or model of a person. After the plague, a new, gruesome style appeared. It is called the cadaver tomb, or transy tomb. Imagine a stone monument. On the top level, you see the bishop or the knight dressed in gold and silk, looking perfect. But below that shelf, carved in stone, is a rotting corpse. The skin is pulling back from the skull. Worms are crawling in and out of the ribcage. Frogs are eating the eyes. The inscription often reads, "I was what you are. You will be what I am." This is the memento mori. Memento mori, Latin phrase. Remember, you must die. This wasn't just morbid decoration. It was a rhetorical argument carved in rock. It shouted to the viewer, "Your vanity is pointless. Your wealth is temporary. The only thing that matters is the state of your soul." The survivors of the plague developed a macabre fascination with death. Macabre, adjective. Disturbing and horrifying because of involvement with or depiction of death and injury. Why? Psychologists suggest this was a form of desensitization. Desensitization, noun. The process of reducing sensitivity or emotional responsiveness to a stimulus, like fear or shock, after repeated exposure. By carving skeletons on the walls, by painting the Dance of Death, where popes and peasants hold hands with corpses. They were trying to tame their fear. They were making death a familiar neighbor rather than a sudden monster. But there was another, more subtle shift happening in the English language and mind. As the decades passed, 1360s, 1370s, the arrow of wrath theory began to wear thin. The plague kept coming back. It returned in 1361, the children's plague, then again in 1369. If it was a punishment for sin, why wasn't the punishment working? Why were people still sinning? And why were innocent children dying in the second wave? A new intellectual movement began to rise. It moved away from God is angry to God is complex. People began to ask about predestination. Predestination, noun. The divine foreordaining of all that will happen, especially with regard to the salvation of some and not others. Maybe it wasn't about what you did. Maybe it was about who you were. This theological shift was dangerous. If God has already decided who lives and who dies, why pay the priest? Why go on pilgrimage? The church fought hard to keep control of the narrative. They emphasized the sacraments, rituals like communion and baptism, as the only safety net. But they couldn't stop the skepticism. This era gave birth to a specific English character type, the pardoner. A pardoner was a man licensed to sell indulgences. An indulgence was a piece of paper signed by a bishop or the pope that promised to reduce your time in purgatory. In the chaos after the plague, the demand for these papers skyrocketed. It was the Bitcoin of the 14th century, a speculative spiritual currency. But many pardoners were frauds. They sold pig bones as saints' relics. They sold fake papers. Geoffrey Chaucer, writing his Canterbury Tales in the late 1300s, depicts the pardoner as a villain. He is greasy, deceptive, and greedy. He carries a jar of pig's bones and claims they are holy. Chaucer's audience, the English learners of history, would have recognized this figure instantly. The pardoner represented the corruption of the explanation. The people were starting to see that the religious meaning of the plague had become a business, a very profitable business. This realization brings us to the accidental twist of the late 14th century. The plague, which was supposed to make people more obedient to God, actually made them more critical of the church. The fear of death was replaced by a disgust at hypocrisy. The survivors were tougher. They were richer because of higher wages, and they were smarter. They had seen the curtain fall. In 1381, this tension would explode in the peasants' revolt. The revolt wasn't just about taxes. It was about dignity. The priest John Ball preached to the rebels. When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? Meaning, when the world started, there were no lords and no serfs. We were all equal. This was a radical, almost heretical idea, and it was fed by the leveling power of the plague. The sickness had treated the lord and the serf exactly the same, so why should the law treat them differently? We will see the authorities strike back. We will look at how the church and the crown joined forces to crush this new, independent thinking. We will examine the concept of heresy and how it was used to police the boundaries of the mind. With the peasants' revolt of 1381 and the radical question, who was then the gentleman? The survivors of the plague had realized a dangerous truth. Inequality is man-made, not God-made. But the powers of Europe were not going to give up without a fight. The church and the state, the king and nobles, realized they had a common enemy: dissent. To crush dissent, they needed a weapon stronger than a sword. They needed a word that could kill a man's reputation before it killed his body. That word was heresy. Let's define it carefully. In the late 1300s, after the chaos of the plague, the definition of heresy began to expand. It wasn't just about believing the wrong thing about the Trinity. It was about challenging the social order. If you said, "The plague happened because the priests are greedy," that was bordering on heresy. If you said, "I can read the Bible in English myself," that was heresy. The biology to society mirror is fascinating here. The plague, biology, attacked the physical body. Heresy, idea, was seen as a plague of the social body. The bishops described heretics using medical language. They called them cancers, rotten limbs, or infected sheep that must be cut off to save the flock. This brings us to a towering figure in English history, John Wycliffe. Wycliffe was an Oxford scholar who looked at the post-plague world and saw corruption everywhere. He saw the cadaver tombs and the rich pardoners, and he felt sick. He argued that the Bible should be the only authority, not the Pope. He translated the Bible into English so common people could read it. His followers were called Lollards. The Lollards were the spiritual children of the Black Death. They were the survivors who said, "We don't need the middleman." But the empire strikes back. In 1401, the King of England passed a terrifying new law, De heretico comburendo, on the burning of heretics. For the first time in English history, the state could legally burn you alive for your opinion. Why burn? Because fire cleanses, and because fire mimics the fires of hell that the heretic was destined for. It was the ultimate deterrent. The first victim was William Sawtry, a priest who refused to accept the official church teachings. He was burned at Smithfield in London. The message to the public was clear. The plague was God's fire. The stake is the king's fire. Stay in line. But here is the emotional wave shift. The authorities wanted to create dread, but in many people, they created martyrdom. When people saw their neighbors burning for wanting to read the Bible, it didn't always make them obedient. Sometimes it made them quiet, but stubborn. This is the origin of the English privacy. The idea that what I believe in my house is my business. You keep your head down. You conform on the outside. But inside, you keep your own counsel. The religious meaning of the plague had now split into two streams. 1. The official stream. The plague is a punishment for disobedience. We need more processions, more statues, more money for the church. 2. The underground stream. The plague showed us that the church is weak. We need a personal connection to God without the greed. This underground stream would flow silently for 100 years until it erupted in the Reformation. But let's look at another surprising outcome of this era: the accidental twist in the realm of women. The plague was an equal opportunity killer. It killed men and women alike. But in the labor shortage that followed, women found themselves with new economic power. Widows inherited businesses. Wives ran breweries and weaving shops while their husbands were sick or dead. And in religion, women began to claim a voice. Meet Julian of Norwich. She was an anchoress, a woman who lives in a cell attached to a church, who lived through the worst of the plague years. In 1373, while death was all around her, she had a series of visions. She wrote them down in a book called Revelations of Divine Love. This is the first book in the English language known to be written by a woman. Her theology was radically different from the fire and brimstone priests. She did not see a God of arrows and scourges. She saw a God of motherhood. She famously wrote, "All shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of thing shall be well." Think about that sentence. In the middle of the apocalypse, with bodies piling up in the streets, she wrote about wellness. This is resilience. Julian refused to accept the argument from consequence, that suffering equals punishment. Instead, she argued that suffering was a mystery that would eventually be resolved in love. It was a quiet, revolutionary voice. It offered a third option. Not, God is angry. Not, there is no God, but God is suffering with us. This brings us to a linguistic shift. The vocabulary of comfort. Before the plague, religious language was often about glory and judgment. After the plague, there was a desperate hunger for comfort. You see this in the rise of the cult of the Virgin Mary, the Mater Dolorosa, the sorrowful mother. The sorrowful mother. She had watched her son die. She understood the pain of the plague mothers. So, while the fires of heresy burned in the market squares, the candles of comfort burned in the side chapels. The society was traumatized, and, like a trauma patient, it was oscillating between aggression, burning heretics, and the need for a hug, Mother Mary. We will leave the medieval era and see how these deep scars traveled forward in time. We will see how the plague mentality resurfaced when a new disease struck London in 1665. We will see if the lessons were learned, or if the same religious meanings played out all over again. With the dual response to the trauma of the medieval plague, the aggression of the heretic hunters, and the comfort of the mystics. Now we fast forward. The wheel of time turns. It is 1665. London is once again a city of ghosts. This is the Great Plague of London. It is the last major outbreak of the bubonic plague in England. 300 years have passed since the Black Death of 1348. Science has advanced. We have telescopes. We have the Royal Society. We have the beginnings of the Enlightenment. Surely the religious meaning has changed. Surely we no longer blame divine arrows. The answer is a signature differentiator of history. Technology changes quickly. Human psychology changes slowly. In 1665, the official government decree still called the plague a visitation. Visitation, noun. An appearance of a divine or supernatural being, in this context, a punishment sent by God. The king, Charles II, commanded a monthly day of fasting and humiliation. The logic was identical to 1348. We have sinned. We must starve ourselves to show God we are sorry. But there was a new flavor to the religious argument in 1665. It was political. Just a few years earlier, England had been a republic under Oliver Cromwell, the Puritans. They had beheaded the previous king. Then, in 1660, the monarchy was restored. So, when the plague hit in 1665, everyone used it to prove their side was right. The royalists, king's supporters, said, "God is punishing the city for the rebellion and the killing of the old king." The Puritans, religious dissenters, said, "God is punishing the city for the immorality and debauchery of the new king." It was a partisan plague. Partisan, adjective, prejudiced in favor of a particular cause. This is a key rhetorical pattern. Confirmation bias. Confirmation bias, noun phrase. The tendency to interpret new evidence as confirmation of one's existing beliefs. The plague was a blank screen. Every group projected their own movie onto it. But let's look at the streets. In 1665, the houses of the infected were marked, not with a scientific warning, but with a religious symbol. A red cross was painted on the door, and above it, the words, "Lord, have mercy upon us." It was a prayer and the prison sentence in one. This period gives us one of the most famous accounts in the English language, A Journal of the Plague Year by Daniel Defoe. Defoe wrote it later, but based it on deep research and family memories. He describes a city driven mad by portents. Portent, noun. A sign or warning that something momentous or calamitous is likely to happen. People claimed to see a flaming sword in the sky. They saw ghosts in the churchyards. They bought plague water and amulets with the word abracadabra written in a triangle. This is the emotional wave returning to superstition. Superstition, noun. Excessively credulous belief in and reverence for supernatural beings. Despite the 300 years of progress, fear pushed people back to magical thinking. But there was a biology-to-society mirror shift here. In 1348, the priests died. In 1665, many of the rich clergy fled. The Anglican priests, the official church, largely left London for the countryside. This left a gap. Into this gap stepped the nonconformists. Nonconformist, noun. A member of a Protestant church which dissents from the established Church of England. These were the Puritans, the Quakers, the people who were technically illegal. They stayed. They preached in the empty pulpits. They visited the sick. This created a massive problem for the government. The people they wanted to suppress were the only ones acting like heroes. The accidental twist of 1665 is that the plague actually strengthened the dissenters. By staying to die with their flocks, they earned a moral authority that the king's laws couldn't take away. One famous example is the village of Eyam in Derbyshire. When the plague arrived in Eyam, carried in a box of cloth from London, the village rector, William Mompesson, made a radical decision. He urged the villagers to quarantine themselves. He told them, "If we stay, we may die, but if we run, we will kill the north of England." This was altruism. Altruism, noun. The belief in or practice of disinterested and selfless concern for the well-being of others. But notice how he framed it. He didn't just use science, contagion. He used religion. He called it a sacred duty. He turned the quarantine into a spiritual act. The villagers agreed. They drew a ring of stones around the village. They did not cross it. They paid for their food by leaving vinegar-soaked coins in holes in the stones. They died in droves. 260 out of 350 villagers perished. But the plague did not spread to the nearby towns. Eyam is the counter-argument to the mob violence of Part 3. It shows that religion could also be a force for discipline and sacrifice. This is a crucial nuance for English learners. The religious meaning wasn't always hysteria. Sometimes it was a quiet, steel-spined courage. The sermon at the grave became a central part of English literature during this time. The phrase, "ashes to ashes, dust to dust," became the rhythm of the year. But as the winter of 1665 approached, the Great Fire of London, 1666, was waiting in the wings. The fire would do what the prayers could not. It would cleanse the city of the rats and the filth, though historians debate exactly how much the fire stopped the plague versus the natural dying out of the disease. But the fire reinforced the divine wrath narrative perfectly. First, God sent the flood, plague. Then, God sent the fire. It was biblical. It was undeniable. Or was it? A new voice was rising. The voice of empiricism. Empiricism. Noun. The theory that all knowledge is derived from sense experience. Men like Isaac Newton, who was inventing calculus while hiding from the plague in the countryside, were beginning to see the universe not as a courtroom of moral judgment, but as a machine of laws. If the apple falls because of gravity, maybe the man dies because of a microbe. The transition was slow. It would take another 200 years to find the germ, but the monopoly of the sin narrative was breaking. We will jump to the Victorian era. We will see how the religious meaning shifted from God hates sinners to God hates dirt. We will explore the movement of muscular Christianity and the crusade for sanitation. With the cooling embers of the Great Fire of London and the slow rise of scientific thinking, now we leap forward to the 19th century, the Victorian era. The enemy has changed. It is no longer the bubonic plague. It is cholera. Cholera is a terrifying disease. It kills by rapid dehydration. A healthy person can turn into a shriveled, blue-skinned corpse in a matter of hours. When cholera hit Britain in 1832, the old religious meaning reflex kicked in. The government declared a national day of fasting and humiliation, just like in 1665. But this time, there was a loud voice of dissent. And it didn't come from heretics. It came from the newspapers. A famous headline asked, "Why does the cholera spare the rich and kill the poor?" In the medieval plague, everyone died. But cholera was selective. It thrived in the slums. It thrived where the water was dirty. This observation birthed a new theological concept: sanitary piety. Sanitary, adjective, relating to the conditions that affect hygiene and health. Piety, noun, the quality of being religious or reverent. The Victorians began to believe that cleanliness was not just healthy, it was holy. This is the origin of the famous phrase, "Cleanliness is next to godliness." This was a massive shift in the biology to society mirror. In 1348, you pleased God by whipping your back, pain. In 1850, you pleased God by scrubbing your floor, hygiene. The preachers began to sound like plumbers. They argued that God had created the laws of health, and to ignore them was a sin. If you lived in filth, you were disrespecting the temple of the body. This movement was called muscular Christianity. Muscular Christianity, noun phrase. A Christian life of brave and cheerful physical activity, especially associated with the Victorian era. It combined a stiff upper lip, sports, and a crusade against dirt. But there was still a battle over the cause. Most people believed in the miasma theory. Miasma, noun, an unpleasant or unhealthy smell or vapor. They thought disease came from bad air, rotting organic matter. This fit the religious view perfectly. The slums smelled bad because the people were lazy and immoral. The smell was the physical manifestation of their sin. Then came the accidental twist. A man named John Snow. He was a doctor, not a priest. In 1854, during a cholera outbreak in Soho, London, he did something radical. He didn't look at the sky. He didn't look at the Bible. He looked at a map. He plotted the deaths. He saw they clustered around a single water pump on Broad Street. He removed the handle of the pump. The dying stopped. This moment is iconic. It is the birth of epidemiology. Epidemiology, noun, the branch of medicine which deals with the incidence, distribution, and possible control of diseases. But here is the fascinating conflict. The religious authorities rejected Snow's findings. Why? Because if the disease is caused by a tiny, invisible germ in the water, it has no moral meaning. If a saint drinks the water, he dies. If a sinner drinks the water, he dies. The germ is an atheist. This terrified the Victorian moralists. They needed the disease to be a judgment. They needed it to be a punishment for drunkenness or laziness. If it was just a random accident of swallowing a microbe, where was God's justice? The Lancet, a medical journal, even criticized Snow, saying his theory was too depressing. They preferred the miasma theory because miasma could be fought with fresh air and better morals. This reveals a deep human need for narrative. Narrative, noun, a spoken or written account of connected events, a story. We prefer a scary story that makes sense, God is punishing us, to a boring story that is random, I drank dirty water. But the emotional wave was turning toward the pragmatic. The Victorians were engineers. They built the massive London sewer system, Joseph Bazalgette's masterpiece. And as the sewers were built, the cholera vanished. The religious meaning had to adapt again. It couldn't claim that disease was a direct arrow from God. So it shifted to the realm of social gospel. The sermon became, God is not sending the cholera. We are causing the cholera by allowing our brothers to live in squalor. The sin is not in the victim. The sin is in the society that ignores the victim. This was a profound inversion. In 1348, you are sick because you sinned. In 1880, you are sick because we failed you. This laid the groundwork for the modern welfare state. The idea that health is a collective responsibility, not a private spiritual test. But before we congratulate the Victorians for solving it, we must look at the dark side of their science. As they discovered germs, they also discovered degeneracy. They began to use biological language to describe criminals and the poor. They measured skulls, They talked about bad blood. The arrow of wrath was replaced by the gene of defect. The vocabulary of eugenics began to appear. Eugenics, noun. The study of how to arrange reproduction within a human population to increase the occurrence of heritable characteristics regarded as desirable. It was a new religion, dressed in a lab coat. And it would lead to horrors in the 20th century that would make the medieval bonfires look small. We will enter the 20th century. We will look at the Spanish flu of 1918, a pandemic that killed more people than the Black Death, yet is strangely forgotten in our cultural memory. Why was there no religious meaning for the flu? Why was it the silent plague? With the triumph of Victorian engineering and the rise of the social gospel, now we arrive at 1918. The Great War, World War I, is ending. The trenches are soaked in blood. And then, a new enemy rises from the mud. The Spanish flu. It infected 500 million people, 1/3 of the world's population. It killed at least 50 million. But here is the signature differentiator of this pandemic: the silence. In 1348, the chroniclers couldn't stop writing about the end of the world. In 1665, Defoe wrote a bestseller about the horror. But in 1918, there are very few great novels, paintings, or sermons about the flu. Why? The religious meaning had collapsed under the weight of the war. Europe had just spent 4 years praying for victory. Every nation claimed, God is on our side. Every soldier wore a belt buckle or carried a Bible, saying God was with them. And yet, 20 million people died in the trenches. When the flu arrived, the spiritual tank was empty. People were numb. Numb, adjective, deprived of the power of sensation. You cannot feel the arrow of wrath if you have been under artillery fire for 4 years. The flu just seemed like one more pile of bodies. It wasn't a visitation. It was a statistic. This led to a linguistic shift towards Stoicism. Stoicism, noun. The endurance of pain or hardship, without a display of feelings and without complaint. The newspapers didn't preach repentance. They preached carry on. In England, the authorities suppressed news of the flu to keep morale high for the war effort. It was called Spanish flu only because Spain was neutral and didn't censor the news, so it looked like it started there. The biology to society mirror here is tragic. The virus attacked the lungs, drowning the victim in their own fluid. Society was drowning in censorship. Censorship, noun. The suppression or prohibition of any parts of books, films, news, etc. that are considered obscene, politically unacceptable, or a threat to security. Because the government wouldn't admit the scale of the danger, the church couldn't organize a massive response. There were no great processions. There were no flagellants. Instead, the religious meaning turned inward into spiritualism. Spiritualism, noun. A system of belief or religious practice, based on supposed communication with the spirits of the dead, especially through mediums. After 1918, millions of grieving people turned to seances. They wanted to talk to their dead sons. They didn't care about sin or judgment. They just wanted to say goodbye. Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Sherlock Holmes, became a huge advocate of spiritualism after losing his son. He represented a generation that had lost faith in the big God of the cathedral and was looking for the small ghost in the parlor. This era teaches us a powerful lesson about fatigue. Fatigue, noun. Extreme tiredness resulting from mental or physical exertion or illness. A society can only handle so much apocalypse. After the Black Death, the Reformation, the Civil Wars, and the Great War, the English mind simply refused to panic about the flu. They buried the dead quickly and tried to forget. But the religious meaning of illness didn't die. It just went dormant. It waited for a new disease that could be moralized. It waited until the 1980s. The AIDS crisis brought the medieval arrow of wrath back with terrifying speed. Suddenly, the language of 1348 was on the front pages of 1983. The gay plague, nature's revenge, God's judgment on permissiveness. We saw the return of the stigma. Stigma, noun. A mark of disgrace associated with a particular circumstance, quality, or person. Preachers once again stood in pulpits and used the argument from consequence. They are sick, therefore they must have sinned. But this time, the counter-narrative was ready. The lessons of John Snow, Part 8, and the compassion of the social gospel, Part 8, combined. Activists fought back with a new vocabulary. They replaced victim with person living with HIV. They replaced plague with pandemic. They replaced sin with virus. The battle over AIDS was a battle over metaphor. Metaphor, noun. A figure of speech in which a word or phrase is applied to an object or action to which it is not literally applicable. Susan Sontag wrote a famous book, Illness as Metaphor. She argued that we must strip illness of its meaning. Cancer is not a war. AIDS is not a judgment. They are just biological events. This is the modern secular ideal. But is it true? When COVID-19 arrived in 2020, did we treat it as just a biological event? Or did we look for meaning? Did we blame wet markets? Did we blame irresponsible youth? Did we create new rituals of sanitary piety? Masks, sanitizers. The accidental twist of the modern age is that even without God, we still act religiously. We still have taboos. No mask equals heretic. Rituals. Washing hands for 20 seconds equals prayer. Excommunication. Cancel culture / shaming those who break the rules. The content of the religion has changed. Science instead of God. But the form is identical to 1348. We still cannot accept that death is random. We still need to believe that if we follow the rules, we will be safe. We will conclude our journey. We will summarize the 700-year arc of the religious meaning of the plague. And I will give you a final toolkit for the future. A set of English concepts to help you decode the next crisis. We began this journey on the docks of Messina in 1347, watching a Genoese ship bring the end of the world. Now we stand in the present day. We are looking back at 7 centuries of fear, prayer, fire, and science. What have we learned? We have learned that the religious meaning of the plague is not really about God. It is about uncertainty. Uncertainty, noun. The state of being uncertain, something that is unknown or indefinite. When the human mind faces a gap in knowledge, like an invisible virus, it cannot leave that gap empty. It rushes to fill it with a story. In 1348, the story was The Arrow of Wrath. In 1665, the story was The Broom of Destruction. In 1854, the story was Filth is Sin. In 1983, the story was Nature's Revenge. The story changes, but the psychological mechanism is identical. We need the suffering to have a purpose. This brings us to our final toolkit for the future. Here are 3 concepts you need to master to understand not just history, but the news of tomorrow. Concept 1. The illusion of control. Throughout this documentary, we saw people trying to control the uncontrollable. The flagellants whipped themselves to control God. The Victorians built sewers to control miasma. We wear masks and track data to control the curve. There is a useful English idiom, grasping at straws. It means trying any method, even a desperate one, to save yourself. History teaches us that while science gives us tools, it does not give us dominion. Nature is still stronger than we are. Concept 2. The other. We saw how quickly fear turns into blame. The Jews in Strasbourg, Part 3. The hasty priests, Part 4. The degenerates of the Victorian slums, Part 8. There is a dark pattern in English rhetoric called othering. Othering, verb/noun. Viewing or treating a person or group of people as intrinsically different from and alien to oneself. When the next pandemic comes, and it will, watch for this word. They. They brought the virus. They are spreading it. They are not like us. Recognize this for what it is, an ancient immune response of the tribe, trying to purify itself. Concept 3. Solidarity. This is the most important word. Solidarity, noun. Unity or agreement of feeling or action, especially among individuals with a common interest. Mutual support within a group. We saw this in the village of Eyam, Part 7. They didn't survive by blaming others. They didn't survive by running away. They survived, or rather they died, with dignity, by holding the line together. We saw it in the social gospel, Part 8, that built the hospitals. We saw it in the nurses and doctors who, like the priests of 1348, stayed at their posts. The biology to society mirror ends here. Biology divides us. It picks the weak, the old, the poor. Solidarity unites us. It is the only force strong enough to break the mirror. Conclusion. The Black Death killed 50% of Europe, but it also killed the idea that the Church was infallible. It birthed the English language as a language of protest. It built the universities. It forced us to look at the stars and the water pumps. It made us modern. The next time you hear a siren wail in the city or read a headline about a new mystery illness, do not be afraid. Remember the arrow. Remember the scourge. Remember the handle on the pump. We have been here before. We have survived the silence. And we will survive whatever comes next. This has been London Gritty Chronicles. Thank you for watching.